Fact, the moment you stopped chasing, something shifted. Not in them first, but in you. And now, without warning, they feel it. Your silence is louder than your words ever were. Your stillness is questioning everything they thought they controlled. And what happens next will reveal whether they grow or retreat. You didn't stop chasing because you gave up. You stopped because something in you woke up. You realized love is not proven through pursuit. Connection is not built through exhaustion. And your worth does not increase the more you run after someone who keeps running away. When you stepped back, the avoidant noticed, but not in the way movies portray it. They didn't suddenly rush toward clarity. They felt something far more unsettling, the absence of pressure and the presence of choice. You see, when you were chasing, their nervous system stayed comfortable. They knew where you were emotionally. They knew you would reach out. They knew you would bend, wait, and explain. But now, they did. Fact, no. And uncertainty is terrifying to someone who avoids intimacy. So what do? They test, not always consciously, not always maliciously, but inevitably. They may send a casual message that means nothing and everything. They may reappear with humor, nostalgia, or timing that feels accidental. They may act as if nothing changed, hoping you'll fall back into the old rhythm. This is not love yet. This is assessment. They are asking, are you still there for me, even if I don't fully show up? And here is where wisdom matters. If you respond from habit, the test passes, but you fail yourself. If you respond from fear, the cycle restarts. But if you respond from grounded self-worth, something sacred happens. You don't chase. You don't punish. You don't over-explain. You remain steady, and steadiness is confronting. Because your calm tells them, I am open, but I am not available for confusion. I care, but I will not abandon myself. I am no longer motivated by being chosen. I, fact, am aligned with truth. This is where divine order enters the dynamic. What is meant for you does not require pursuit. What is healthy does not test your dignity. And what is real rises when pressure is removed. At this stage, the avoidant has two paths. 1. They retreat because your boundaries force them to face wounds they are not ready to heal. Or 2. They grow, slowly, awkwardly, but sincerely. And growth only happens when they realize they can't access you through distance anymore. Your silence didn't punish them. It purified the connection. It separated attachment from alignment, need from choice, fear from love. Remember this, tests are not invitations to prove yourself. They are opportunities to reveal who you have become, and who you have become no longer chases energy that runs. You attract what is ready. You meet what is willing. You stand where peace lives. If they come forward with clarity, you meet them with truth. If they hover in uncertainty, you stay rooted in yours. Fact. Elf. Because when you stopped chasing, you didn't lose them. You found yourself. And that always changes everything. When you stop chasing, the avoidant doesn't immediately interpret it as healing, growth, or even strength. At first, it registers as something far more subtle and unsettling to their internal world. Loss of control. Not control over you in a manipulative sense, but control over the emotional predictability that once existed between you. When you were chasing, there was a rhythm they could unconsciously rely on. They may not have been fully present, but they understood the pattern. You reach out, you initiate, you repair, you keep the emotional bridge alive. That rhythm creates a kind of psychological safety for someone who struggles with emotional intimacy, because it allows them to remain partially engaged without ever fully stepping into vulnerability. But the moment you withdraw that pursuit, the rhythm collapses. And what replaces rhythm is silence, not just external fact, silence, but emotional unpredictability. For an avoidant, unpredictability can feel like pressure, even when no pressure is being applied. Your absence of chasing does not feel neutral to them. It feels like a shift in the emotional environment they were accustomed to navigating. Suddenly, they are no longer being emotionally led, softened, or pursued. They are faced with a space where they are required to initiate, to risk, or to confront what they have been avoiding. This is where the illusion of control begins to dissolve. While they may have appeared distant or detached during the dynamic, there was still a subconscious reliance on your consistency. Consistency from you meant they never had to fully question whether connection would remain available. It was always there at arm's length. And when something is always available, it is often taken for granted, even if it is valued. But when you stop chasing, availability becomes uncertain, not because you have become cruel or withdraw, and in a punitive way, but because you have stepped into self-respect. And self-respect changes the emotional math entirely. The avoidant mind, when confronted with this shift, does not immediately move toward emotional clarity. Instead, it often moves toward assessment. They begin to observe indirectly. They may check your presence through small signals, social media, timing of replies, mutual spaces, trying to determine whether your withdrawal is temporary or intentional. This observation is not always conscious, but it is instinctive. Because when someone who used to pursue you no longer does, the nervous system interprets it as a change in attachment security. What makes this moment powerful is that your silence is no longer empty, it becomes communicative. It speaks in a language they did not expect you to learn. Detachment without bitterness, absence without anger, distance without explanation. And this kind of silence is far more impactful than emotional confrontation because it does, in fact, not give them something to push against. It simply removes the structure they were used to leaning on. At this stage, the avoidant may experience internal contradiction. On one hand, there is relief because the pressure they associate with being pursued has decreased. On the other hand, there is discomfort because the emotional safety net they relied on is no longer automatically present. This duality creates cognitive dissonance. They may not label it as loss, but they feel the disruption of equilibrium. And human beings, especially those with avoidant tendencies, often respond to disrupted equilibrium by testing whether what was lost can still be accessed. So subtle tests begin to appear. A message that seems casual but carries timing that feels intentional. A reappearance that avoids accountability but seeks familiarity. A gesture that attempts to restore old dynamics without addressing what caused the shift. These are not necessarily calculated manipulations, they are exploratory. Ori behaviors. They are ways of asking without directly asking. Is your emotional availability still the same as before? But underneath all of this is the deeper truth. When you stop chasing, you are no longer reinforcing the dynamic that allowed avoidance to remain unchallenged. You are no longer participating in the emotional asymmetry, and that absence of pursuit forces a recalibration. Not always immediate, not always visible, but internal and unavoidable. Because when one person in a dynamic stops overextending, the entire structure of the connection is forced to reveal what it was built on: reciprocity or dependence. And in that revelation, the avoidant is no longer just observing you. They are also being confronted by themselves. Doesn't just end communication, it initiates reflection. And for an avoidant, reflection is not a comfortable space, it is a confronting one. When you were actively chasing, your presence acted like emotional noise in the background of their life. Even, if they were not responding fully, even if they were distant or inconsistent, there was still a steady current of your energy reaching them. That current created a kind of emotional buffer. It kept things from becoming too still, too quiet, too internally revealing. But when you withdraw that energy, something changes in the emotional atmosphere. The noise disappears. And what replaces it is not peace at first, but exposure, because silence removes distraction. It strips away the constant reassurance that someone else is holding the emotional weight of the connection. And in that absence, the avoidant is left alone with something they often spend a lot of energy avoiding: themselves. Silence becomes a mirror because it no longer tells them what you feel, what you want, or what you are willing to tolerate. Instead, it reflects their own emotional state back to them without distortion. And what it reflects is often not fully resolved. It may reflect hesitation, fear of closeness unresolved, levied attachment wounds, or even suppressed longing that was easier to ignore when you were actively pursuing. When someone is constantly being approached, it is easy for them to stay in reaction mode. But when the approach stops, reaction is replaced with contemplation. This is where the deeper psychological shift begins. The avoidant is forced into a space where there is no external emotional pressure guiding the narrative. They are no longer responding to your messages, your efforts, your attempts to bridge distance. Instead, they are confronted with your absence, which is far more powerful because it is not demanding anything. It is simply present as a void where your energy used to be. And that void becomes a reflection surface for their own emotional patterns. In that reflection, something uncomfortable often emerges. Awareness of attachment, not necessarily secure attachment, but the recognition that there was attachment at all. Avoidant individuals are often skilled at minimizing their own emotional investment, sometimes even to themselves, but silence disrupts that defense mechanism. When you are no longer there to activate their avoidance response, they are left with the echo of what your presence meant. They begin to notice the space you occupied, not just physically or communicatively, but emotionally. And silence does not argue. It does not explain. It does not defend itself. This is what makes it so powerful. Because without words to push against, the avoidant cannot easily externalize discomfort. They cannot project confusion onto your actions if there are no new actions to interpret. Instead, the interpretation turns inward. They begin to ask questions they may not consciously verbalize. Why does this feel different? Why am I thinking about this more now that it is quiet? Why does the absence feel heavier than the presence did? This inward turn is the beginning of self-confrontation. And self-confrontation is exactly what avoidance strategies are gain to delay. But silence bypasses those strategies because it does not pursue, it does not pressure, and it does not escalate. It simply exists. And in existing, it creates emotional space where suppressed awareness begins to surface. What makes this mirror effect even more intense is that it is non-reactive. When you were chasing, your reactions gave them something to interpret and respond to. Your emotional signals created movement they could either engage with or retreat from. But silence removes that dynamic entirely. It removes emotional predictability. And in the absence of predictability, the mind begins to fill in gaps. For the avoidant, those gaps often get filled with reflection on what has changed. They may revisit past interactions in memory, reinterpreting them through the lens of your current absence. Moments that were once dismissed or minimized can begin to take on new meaning. A message they didn't prioritize may suddenly feel more significant. A conversation they have, avoided may resurface internally with new weight. Not because the past has changed, but because the emotional context has shifted. Silence also interrupts the assumption of permanence. When someone consistently pursues, there is an unconscious belief that their presence is stable, regardless of reciprocity. But when that pursuit stops, permanence is questioned. And when permanence is questioned, value often becomes clearer. Not necessarily in a romanticized way, but in a destabilizing way that forces attention. In this way, your silence is not empty. It is active. It is doing something internally in the other person that words could not accomplish. It is creating space where avoidance cannot fully operate at its usual speed, because avoidance relies on movement distraction, distancing, deflection. Silence removes the target for those movements, and what remains is stillness. And in that stillness, the avoidant is no longer just aware of you. They become aware of their own response to lozi, ng access to your energy. Avoidant individuals often don't approach emotional distance in a direct or fully conscious way. Instead, they operate through patterns of testing, especially when something in the dynamic shifts and they sense they are no longer in the familiar position of emotional control or emotional predictability. When you stop chasing, something in the relational structure changes, and they begin to recalibrate without openly acknowledging that recalibration is happening. These tests are not always calculated or malicious. In many cases, they are unconscious attempts to reestablish familiarity, to measure whether connection is still available, and to determine whether emotional access to you has truly changed. A key thing to understand is that avoidant testing is rarely about manipulation in the dramatic sense people assume. It is more often about emotional uncertainty management. When someone who was previously available, responsive, or pursuing suddenly becomes ST1. All the avoidant nervous system does not interpret that stillness as simple independence at first. It interprets it as ambiguity, and ambiguity creates discomfort. So instead of directly asking for clarity, they test the edges of your availability to gather information without exposing their own vulnerability. These tests can appear subtle on the surface, a message that arrives without depth or context, a sudden reappearance after silence, a casual comment on something personal you posted, even humor that seems light but carries an undertone of reconnection. What makes these actions tests is not the action itself, but the intention beneath it. They are checking whether the emotional channel between you is still open without committing to emotional openness themselves. From a psychological standpoint, this behavior is rooted in approach avoidance conflict. The avoidant part of them wants distance because distance feels safe, controlled, and non-threatening. But the attached part of the effect, M still recognizes value in connection, familiarity, and emotional grounding. When you stop chasing, both systems are activated at the same time. The connection feels less pressured, which reduces avoidance resistance, but it also feels less secure, which activates curiosity and concern. Testing becomes the bridge between those two internal forces. For example, they may send a message that seems random or neutral, like a simple hey or a reaction to something insignificant. On the surface, it looks casual, but beneath it is a question. Will you still respond the way you used to? If you respond quickly and emotionally, the old dynamic is confirmed. If you respond slowly or neutrally, they receive new data that the dynamic has changed. Either way, they are gathering emotional information without revealing their own position. Another form of testing involves timing. They may reach out at unexpected moments late at night during emotional vulnerability or after a period of your silence. Fact. Timing is not accidental in emotional systems like this. It is often driven by internal states. A memory gets triggered, loneliness surfaces, or curiosity builds, and instead of processing those feelings internally, they externalize them through contact. But again, the contact is often minimal, as if they are dipping a toe into emotional water rather than fully entering it. There is also the test of inconsistency. They may show brief warmth followed by distance again. This creates a push-pull dynamic that allows them to observe your reaction. Do you chase again? Do you ask questions? Do you try to stabilize the connection? Your response becomes part of the data they use to determine how safe or risky emotional engagement with you feels. What is important to understand is that these tests are not just about you, they are also about them trying to regulate their own emotional state. When someone is avoidant, direct emotional engagement can feel overwhelming, but complete disconnection, fact, can also feel unsettling once attachment exists. So testing becomes a way to stay connected without fully committing to connection. It is a form of emotional sampling rather than emotional immersion. However, from your side of the experience, these tests can feel confusing, destabilizing, or even hopeful, because they often resemble intimacy without actually being intimacy. They resemble effort without consistency, and they resemble return without resolution. This is why awareness is crucial. Without awareness, it is easy to mistake a test for a breakthrough or a moment of curiosity for sustained change. When you have stopped chasing, your role in this dynamic also changes. The effectiveness of their test depends entirely on your participation in the old pattern. If you respond from the old version of yourself, over-explaining, over-giving, over-investing, you unconsciously validate the old structure. But if you respond with grounded awareness, neutrality, and self-respect, the test low effect its original function. Because at the core of these behaviors is not just curiosity about you, it is uncertainty about whether the emotional dynamic they once controlled or navigated unconsciously still exists. And your response either confirms continuity or confirms change. Your consistency without pursuit creates a paradox that the avoidant mind is not used to handling. In their internal world, emotional safety has often been linked with predictability, but predictability in a very specific form. They expect pursuit to mean availability, and they expect distance to mean withdrawal. When you were chasing, you were readable in a certain way, even if the emotional dynamic was unhealthy or unbalanced. They could anticipate your presence. They could anticipate your effort. They could anticipate that even after distance, you would return, explain, reconnect, or try again. That predictability, while emotionally costly for you, created a stable pattern for them. But when you stop chasing, something subtle shifts. You do not become chaotic. You do not become reactive. You do not become emotionally unstable. Instead, you become consistent in a completely different way. You remain present but not pursuing. You remain open but not overextending. You remain grounded but not chasing validation. And this kind of consistency is unfamiliar to someone who associates love with pursuit and anxiety with attachment. At first, this new consistency creates discomfort. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer participating in the emotional script they are used to. The avoidant system is built around managing closeness by controlling distance. When you were chasing, they could maintain distance without fully losing connection. Now, however, your consistency without pursuit means that connection is no longer guaranteed through your effort. It exists only through mutual engagement. And that changes everything. This is where the emotional duality begins. Fact. On one hand, your consistency without pressure can feel calming to them. There is no urgency. There is no emotional demand. There is no pressure to respond immediately or define the relationship. This absence of pressure can be regulating for someone who experiences closeness as overwhelming. It gives them space to breathe, space to observe, space to exist without emotional obligation. But on the other hand, that same consistency begins to create emotional discomfort because it introduces a new truth. You are no longer dependent on the old dynamic. You are not destabilized by their distance. You are not chasing their attention. You are not reinforcing the cycle that allowed emotional avoidance to remain unchallenged. And this creates a quiet form of internal tension, because what was once assumed your pursuit is no longer guaranteed. This is where emotional safety and emotional discomfort exist at the same time. Your presence says, I am still here, but your lack of pursuit says, I would. In fact, I will not abandon myself to reach you. For an avoidant, this combination is unfamiliar. In previous dynamics, presence and pursuit were fused together. If someone cared, they chased. If someone didn't chase, they left. But you are now breaking that equation. You are present without chasing, and that disrupts their internal model of how relationships function. Over time, this disruption forces a recalibration. They begin to notice that your energy is steady but not invasive. Your communication, if any, is measured rather than desperate. Your absence of pursuit does not come with emotional punishment or dramatic withdrawal. There is no chaos for them to react to, no emotional storm to navigate, no escalation to manage. Instead, there is something far more psychologically demanding: emotional neutrality paired with availability. This neutrality can slowly create a sense of emotional safety because it removes pressure. But it also creates a deeper awareness of choice, because now, engage. In fact, G with you is not being enforced by your pursuit, it is being left to their initiative. And initiative is where avoidance often struggles, because initiative requires emotional exposure. It requires stepping forward without certainty of control. At the same time, your consistency communicates something even more powerful than presence. It communicates self-regulation. It shows that your emotional state is not dependent on their reactions. This is significant because avoidant dynamics often rely on the assumption that emotional distance will create pursuit, and pursuit will reaffirm importance. When that chain is broken, they are no longer able to regulate their internal sense of importance through your reactions. This is why your consistency becomes both grounding and confronting. It grounds the dynamic because it removes volatility. It removes emotional chaos. It removes pressure-driven interaction. But it confronts because it removes the guarantee of access without effort, and access with effect. Without effort is often what unconsciously sustains avoidant comfort in relational patterns. In this new structure, they are faced with a quiet realization. If they want connection, it will require intention. If they want engagement, it will require presence. If they want access to your energy, it will require them to step out of passive observation and into active participation. And that shift is not small for someone who has learned to associate emotional safety with distance. What makes your consistency so transformative is that it does not force change, but it makes old patterns less functional. There is no chasing for them to resist, no emotional chaos for them to retreat from, no desperation for them to dismiss. There is simply a steady presence that no longer compensates for imbalance. And in that steadiness, they begin to see the difference between being emotionally pursued and being emotionally met. And that difference is what slowly changes the entire emotional equation. When, in fact, detachment is rooted in self-worth, it is no longer a reaction to pain, it becomes a conscious alignment with truth. This is where most people misunderstand detachment. They think it is about withdrawal, emotional shutdown, or trying to win by caring less. But real detachment is not built on avoidance of emotion, it is built on clarity of value. It is the moment you stop negotiating your dignity in exchange for inconsistent connection. And when that shift happens, the entire emotional field between you and another person changes, especially in dynamics involving avoidant behavior. Self-worth-based detachment does not arise from anger or from a desire to punish. It arises from awareness. Awareness that your emotional energy is not meant to be continuously poured into uncertainty. Awareness that love, connection, and care are meant to be reciprocal in expression, even if not identical in style. and awareness that your peace is not something to be sacrificed in order to keep someone inelly available who is only partially present. When you detach from this grounded place, you stop participating in emotional patterns that require you to abandon yourself in order to maintain closeness. You no longer chase clarity from people who repeatedly choose ambiguity. You no longer over-explain your value to those who are consistently unsure about your presence. Instead, you begin to embody a quiet internal standard. If something requires you to lose yourself in order to keep it, then it is not aligned with who you are becoming. This kind of detachment is deeply unsettling to an avoidant dynamic, not because it is loud, but because it is silent and stable. Avoidant patterns are often structured around emotional elasticity, meaning the more one person pulls away, the more the other tends to stretch toward them. That stretching creates a predictable cycle. But when you detach from self-worth, you remove elasticity entirely. You are no longer stretching toward inconsistency. You, in fact, are no longer adjusting your emotional shape to maintain proximity. You become grounded, and grounded energy is different. It does not fluctuate based on proximity or distance. It does not amplify itself in desperation or shrink itself in fear. It simply exists in clarity, and clarity is something that cannot be manipulated through avoidance because it is not dependent on the other person's response. In many avoidant dynamics, emotional engagement is maintained through imbalance. One person pursues, the other retreats, and the connection survives in that tension. But when you detach from self-worth, you remove yourself from that tension. You are no longer participating in the chase, but you are also not collapsing into emotional absence. You are simply no longer over-investing in something that is not meeting you halfway. This shift creates a powerful internal reorganization in the other person. Not necessarily immediate realization, but subtle disruption. Because now, the emotional system they were used to is no longer responding in the expected way. There is no overreaction to withdraw from. There is no emotional urgency to delay. There is no repeated reassurance to rely on. Instead, there is a calm boundary that does not need to be enforced through words, because it is already embodied. An embodiment is what makes it impactful. You are no longer saying, "I deserve better." You are living in a way that reflects, "I will not abandon myself for access." This difference is profound. Words can be tested. Emotional reactions can be manipulated. But embodied self-worth cannot be negotiated in the same way because it is not seeking validation from the interaction. This is where divine alignment enters the experience in a meaningful sense. When you stop forcing connection that requires self-abandonment, you begin to align with relationships that do not demand erosion of your inner stability. You are no longer choosing based on intensity or potential, you begin choosing based on reciprocity and emotional truth. And what is not aligned naturally begins to lose its grip, not through rejection, but through lack of participation. For the avoidant, this can feel like distance, but more accurately, it is the removal of emotional dependency cues. They are no longer being pursued in a way that reinforces their avoidance. They are no longer being emotionally managed by your overextension. Instead, they are faced with a version of you that is no longer available on the terms of imbalance, and that forces a different kind of awareness. They may notice your absence of chasing as indifference at first, but over time, what becomes clearer is not indifference, it is boundaries without hostility. It is care without pursuit. It is presence without emotional collapse. And this combination is difficult to categorize within old patterns because it does not fit into the familiar roles of pursuer and distancer. From your side, detachment rooted in self-worth also brings internal clarity. You stop interpreting inconsistency as something you must fix. You stop seeing emotional distance as something you must overcome. And you stop confusing uncertainty with potential. Instead, you begin to observe behavior as information, not as something to emotionally compensate for. This shift reduces emotional noise internally, allowing you to see situations more clearly. And clarity always changes decisions. You begin to choose based on consistency rather than chemistry alone. You begin to value peace over emotional intensity. You begin to recognize that someone's inability to meet you fully is not a challenge for you to solve, but a truth for you to acknowledge. In this space, detachment is not loss, it is restoration. It restores your emotional boundaries, your sense of direction, and your internal authority. And once that authority is restored, you no longer relate to connection from a place of chasing what is uncertain. You relate from a place of recognizing what, in fact, is already aligned. And that recognition quietly changes everything about what you allow, what you engage with, and what you no longer return to. In the end, what you realize is simple but life-changing. When you stopped chasing, you didn't lose love, you reclaimed your self-respect, your peace, and your clarity. And in that space, everything that was meant to grow will grow, and everything that depended on your overextension will naturally fall away. Thank you for listening, thank you for reflecting, and may you carry this awareness forward into every connection you choose from this moment on. Goodbye.